There is a particular smell to the service corridor at the Whitfield estate, a mix of floor wax and the cold mineral breath of a walk-in refrigerator, and I can still summon it whenever I close my eyes. That was the door Estelle Whitfield decided I was to use, and she told me so on the 8th of October, a Sunday, with our daughter asleep in a car seat hooked over my forearm. She stood in the tall front doorway in a cream blazer that probably cost more than my first month of rent as a student, and she looked at the diaper bag on my shoulder the way you'd look at something tracked in on a boot, and she said, in that even, board meeting voice of hers, "Abigail, deliveries and help come around the side. It keeps the entry hall presentable." Not cruel like a slap, cruel like a policy. I remember the brass kickplate on that side door was scuffed white from years of trays and boxes, and I remember thinking the scuff looked like a smile that had given up. I carried my sleeping child down the gravel path to the servants' door, and I did not argue, because I was too tired to argue, and because I already understood, in a place under my ribs, that arguing was not the move. She thought she was drawing a line I would never dare to cross. She had no idea the line was already drawn, years before, in ink she herself had insisted upon, in a folder she had never once bothered to read to the end. To make sense of that Sunday, I have to walk you back about 7 years, to a version of me who would have found this whole story impossible. My name is Abigail Delgado. I never took the Whitfield name, and by the end you'll understand that this was the single most important decision of my adult life. I grew up in Nampa, Idaho, the middle of 3 girls, in a house where my mother worked the overnight shift at a fruit packing plant, and my father drove a route delivering restaurant supply. We were not poor in the way that makes a good story. We were poor in the ordinary grinding way, where the check clears on Friday and is gone by Wednesday. I decided at 15 that I wanted to be in medicine, and because nobody was going to hand me the money, I did it the long way. I worked as a certified nursing assistant while I got my associates, then bridged into a bachelor's in nursing at Boise State, then spent 4 years working the cardiac floor at St. Alphonsus while I finished my master's to become a nurse practitioner. I paid for all of it in installments, the kind of debt where you learn to read the amortization schedule like scripture. By 29, I had my license, a Honda CR-V with 110,000 miles on it, and a very specific pride in the fact that I had never once asked anyone to rescue me. I met Daniel Whitfield in the worst possible circumstance, which is the only reason I trusted him. His father, Harold Whitfield, was admitted to my floor after a heart attack, and for 6 days Daniel slept in the vinyl recliner beside the bed and did not once behave like the heir to anything. He brought me a terrible cup of gas station coffee at 3 a.m. because he'd noticed I was pulling a double, and he apologized that it was terrible, and something about that apology undid a knot I hadn't known I was carrying. He was 34, an engineer by training, quiet in a way that read as steadiness. It was only later, over dinner at a ramen place on 8th Street, that I learned the Whitfields owned Delphi Health, a regional medical staffing and home care company with about 400 employees and contracts across 3 states. I remember setting down my chopsticks and feeling the floor tilt, because I had been about to fall for a nice, tired man, and now there was money attached. And money, in my experience, was never just money. Harold recovered. Daniel and I dated for a 1.5 years, and when he asked me to marry him, on a hiking trail above Lucky Peak Reservoir with a ring he'd clearly agonized over, the first thing his mother did was call me. Estelle Whitfield did not congratulate me. She invited me to lunch at a club in the foothills, ordered a salad neither of us touched, and slid a business card across the table for a firm called Marsh, Corrigan, and Boone. "Every family of a certain size protects itself," she said. "I'm sure a sensible girl like you understands. Daniel is entitled to his romance. The rest of us are entitled to our diligence." She said the word girl the way some people say a diagnosis. She was 58 then, tall, silver hair kept in a blunt cut that never moved, and she had a way of folding her hands on the table like she was closing a ledger. She wanted a prenuptial agreement. She wanted me to sign away any claim to the Whitfield fortune, to Delphi Health, to the estate, to everything. She wanted it clear that I was, and would remain, an outsider with a temporary badge. Here is the thing about growing up counting installments. You read every line. You do not sign anything you have not understood twice. Daniel was mortified by his mother's maneuver and offered to refuse the whole thing, to elope, to walk away from the money entirely. And I told him no, because a man who walks away from his family's money to prove a point still knows the money is there to walk away from. And I did not want to spend my marriage being the woman he sacrificed for. Instead, I did something quieter. I took Estelle's prenup, and I took it to a woman named Dolores Reyna. Dolores had been 3 years ahead of me at Boise State before she pivoted to law, and she'd built a small, sharp practice doing exactly this, reviewing the agreements that wealthy families hand to the people marrying in. She read Estelle's draft in her office with a red pen and a cold expression. And when she finished, she looked at me and said, "Abigail, this is written by someone who thinks you're stupid, which means we get to make it fair, and they'll be too proud to argue." Over 3 weeks, Dolores negotiated changes that Estelle's lawyers waved through because they were, from their side of the table, small. Separate property stays separate? Fine, they wanted that. But Dolores added that any assets, equity, or interests transferred to me during the marriage, by gift or by document, would be mine as separate property, fully and permanently, regardless of the reason for the transfer. And she added one more clause, buried in the section on dispute resolution, that any conflict over ownership of transferred interests would be settled by binding arbitration under the American Arbitration Association in a single proceeding, with the arbitrators ruling final and enforceable. No long court fight, no war of attrition, the richer party always wins. Estelle's lawyers were protecting a fortune from a gold digger. They were not imagining a world in which the family would ever, voluntarily, hand me anything. So they signed, I signed. And here is the part that took me years to understand. The document Estelle designed to keep me out had a small, patient door built into it, and she was the one who'd left it unlocked. The early years were genuinely good, and I won't flatten them to set up the fall. Daniel and I bought a modest house in Meridian, 3 bedrooms, a mortgage we could actually carry on my salary alone if we had to, which mattered to me. I kept working at St. Alphonsus. Harold, my father-in-law, and I became unlikely friends. He was 71 by then, still nominally chairman of Delphi Health, and he liked that I'd built something from nothing, liked that I called him on his nonsense, liked that I understood the clinical side of the business he'd spent 40 years building. He'd trained as a paramedic in the 70s before he ever wore a suit, and under the boardroom polish, he was still that man. We'd sit on the porch of the estate on Sunday afternoons, and he'd walk me through how the company actually worked, the staffing ratios, the state contracts, the home care division that he loved most and the board cared least about because its margins were thin. Estelle tolerated me the way you tolerate a draft in an old house. Not war, weather. Then Harold's health began its long slide, and the small wrong notes started. The first one I remember clearly was at Thanksgiving, the year our daughter Marisol was born, which made me 33 and running on the specific insomnia of a newborn. I'd brought a dish, a green chile pozole my mother used to make, and Estelle received it at the door, looked into the pot, and set it on a side table in the mudroom rather than carrying it to the kitchen. It stayed there all evening. Nobody ate it. When I went to retrieve the pot at the end of the night, it was cold and skinned over, and Estelle passed and said, without stopping, I didn't want to confuse the caterer's menu. A pot of soup. I told myself it was a pot of soup. The second note was money, and it was sharper. Harold, who by then was slipping in and out of lucidity from a series of small strokes, called me one afternoon and asked me to come to the estate. He was clearer that day than he'd been in weeks, and he had his longtime attorney with him, a careful man named Walter Pruitt. and Harold said he wanted to give me something while he still could. He said the home care division of Delphi Health, the part he loved, the thin margin part the board wanted to sell off for parts, should belong to someone who understood what it was for. He transferred to me, that afternoon, a 41% equity interest in Delphi Health, documented and witnessed and filed, with Walter Pruitt handling every formality. 41%. Not a controlling share on its own, but the largest single block, larger than Estelle's own 33, larger than Daniel's 18, with the remaining 8 held by a cousin who lived in Arizona and voted however the wind blew. I want to be honest about what I felt, which was not triumph. It was fear. I understood immediately what a 41% block would do to a family that had spent 7 years reminding me I was a guest. I told Harold he didn't have to, and he took my hand in both of his and said, "I'm not doing it for you, Abigail. I'm doing it for the 400 people whose paychecks the board wants to turn into a line item." And then he said the thing I've never forgotten. "Estelle will fight you. Let her. You're the only one who reads the whole document." He didn't know how right he was, or maybe he did. Estelle found out about the transfer 3 days later, and the temperature in the family dropped to something I could feel through the phone. She never once mentioned the equity to my face. That was her method, I came to learn. She never fought on the field you could see. Instead, the small cruelties multiplied and organized themselves until they weren't small anymore. Marisol's christening was at the Cathedral of the Rosary downtown, and Estelle rearranged the reception seating so that Daniel and I were placed at a side table with the caterer's liaison and an elderly great-aunt who couldn't hear, while she seated the Arizona cousin, the 8% cousin, suddenly very interesting to her, at the family head table. Small. A seating chart. I told myself it was a seating chart. Then came the board meeting I wasn't told about. As a 41% holder, I had the right to notice of every shareholder meeting, and one quietly wasn't sent to me. I only learned it had happened because Walter Pruitt, Harold's attorney, mentioned it in passing, assuming I'd been there. Estelle had convened it to propose selling the home care division to a private equity outfit out of Denver called Cormorant Partners, the exact fate Harold had transferred me the shares to prevent. Because I hadn't been noticed, the vote had been informal, a sense of the room, but the intent was unmistakable. I called Dolores that night, and she said one sentence that I wrote on the whiteboard on my refrigerator: "Document everything, sign nothing, and let them keep underestimating you." I bought a fireproof accordion folder from the Staples on Eagle Road, and I started keeping copies. Every notice, every email, every scrap. And through all of it, Harold declined. He moved into a hospital bed set up in the estate's east sunroom, and I went to see him twice a week, driving straight from a 12-hour shift with Marisol in the back seat, because I loved him and because he had once handed a stranger a terrible cup of coffee's worth of dignity, and I hadn't forgotten. It was on one of those visits, the 8th of October, that Estelle sent me to the servant's door. Let me set that Sunday down completely, because it is the hinge of everything. I had worked a night shift, gotten Marisol from daycare, and driven to the estate because Harold had been asking for me, and the hospice nurse said he didn't have many clear days left. I had a diaper bag on one shoulder, my daughter asleep in the car seat on my arm, and a container of the plain arroz con leche that Harold could still eat when he could eat nothing else. I came up the front walk the way I had come up it for 7 years, and Estelle opened the tall front door before I reached it, which meant she had watched me park and had come to intercept. She stood there in that cream blazer, and she looked at the car seat and the diaper bag and the food container, and she said, "Abigail, deliveries and help come around the side. It keeps the entry hall presentable." I said, "Estelle, I'm here to see Harold." And she said, "You can see him through the side entrance. The front hall is for family and guests, and you are neither delivering nor guesting." She said it pleasantly. She closed the door. I stood on the gravel with my sleeping daughter, and I felt something that was not rage exactly, because rage is hot, and this was cold. It was the specific clarity you get at 4 a.m. on a cardiac floor when a monitor changes its tone and the whole world narrows to what must be done next. I walked around to the side, past the scuffed brass kick plate, through the service corridor with its floor wax and refrigerator breath, and I found Harold in the sunroom, and I fed him arroz con leche, one small spoon at a time, and he held my hand and drifted. And I did not cry in front of him, because he had enough to carry. But in the car afterward, with Marisol finally awake and fussing, and the sun going down over the foothills, I did not cry either. I called Dolores. It went to voicemail, and I left a message, and I heard my own voice come out level and low, a voice I didn't entirely recognize. It's Abigail. I want to know exactly what my shares can do. All of it. Call me Monday. That was the click. Not a decision made in tears. A decision made the way I'd made every real decision in my life, by reading the situation to the end and refusing to look away. What followed was 6 weeks of the quietest, most careful work I have ever done, and I did most of it after midnight with a baby monitor crackling on the counter. Dolores and I built it in layers. The first layer was simply establishing what I already had. She pulled the fully executed equity transfer, confirmed with Walter Pruitt that the 41% was clean, properly filed with the Idaho Secretary of State, and entirely mine. Then she pulled the prenuptial agreement, the one Estelle had forced on me 7 years earlier, and we read it together over a video call at 1 a.m, and Dolores got very quiet, and then she laughed once, a short, surprised sound. "Abigail," she said, "do you remember what we added? Any interest transferred to you during the marriage is your separate property, permanent, regardless of reason. And any dispute over transferred interests goes to binding arbitration, single proceeding, final ruling." Estelle's whole strategy, we realized, depended on dragging any fight over my shares into a long, expensive court battle where the family's money and lawyers would outlast me. But I had, 7 years ago, without knowing it, signed away her ability to do that. The prenup she designed to cage me had converted our fight into a single, fast, binding arbitration, the one arena where money couldn't simply grind me down, where it came down to the documents, and I had the documents. Here is the plain English version, the one I kept repeating to myself until it felt solid. I owned the largest single block of Delphi Health, 41%, given to me legally and permanently. Estelle owned 33, Daniel owned 18. And the prenup meant that if Estelle challenged my ownership, which she would have to sell the division I was blocking, the challenge would be decided fast by an arbitrator on the paper, not on who had more money, on who was right. The second layer was the coalition, because 41% blocks a sale but doesn't force a direction on its own. I needed the 18. I needed Daniel, and this was the part that kept me awake in a different way, because I did not want to win my marriage in an arbitration. So I did the thing I'd been afraid to do for months. I sat Daniel down at our kitchen table after Marisol was asleep, and I laid the whole accordion folder out between us. The unnoticed board meeting, the cormorant sale memo, the seating charts, and yes, the servant's door. And I did not tell him what to feel. I said, "Your mother is going to sell the part of the company your father loved, and she's arranging things so that I can't stop her, and I need to know where you stand, and I need you to know that I'll survive either answer." He looked at the folder for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "She made you use the side door with our daughter in your arms." It wasn't a question. He'd known. He hadn't known I knew he knew, and that was its own quiet grief between us. He said, "My 18 is yours. It was always yours. I've just been a coward about my mother my whole life. 41 and 18 is 59, a majority. The math was done. The third layer was timing and evidence, and here Dolores was ruthless in the best way. Estelle had scheduled the formal shareholder vote on the Cormorant sale for a Saturday morning at the end of November at the family's bank, because part of the deal involved securities held in the bank's trust department, and the transfer documents were being staged there. Delphi's holdings, including the physical share certificates and the trust instruments, were kept in a private viewing room at First Cascade Bank on the outskirts of Boise, a low brick building off the Chinden corridor where the foothills start to go brown. Estelle intended to walk in Saturday, hold her vote, and walk out with a sale to Cormorant Partners. She had told the arbitration clause to no one because she had forgotten it existed. Dolores filed our demand for arbitration 11 days before that Saturday and requested, under the single proceeding clause, an expedited emergency ruling on the ownership and voting rights of my 41% block to be resolved before the shareholder vote could proceed. The arbitrator, a retired judge named Francis Okonkwo, whom the AAA assigned, reviewed the executed transfer, the prenup, and the corporate records, and set an expedited hearing. There is a thing that happens in these families where the system seems, at first, to belong entirely to the powerful. When our arbitration demand landed, Estelle's lawyers at Marsh, Corrigan, and Boone responded with the confidence of people who had never lost. They argued the transfer from Harold was the product of undue influence, that a sick old man had been manipulated by his daughter-in-law, and for about a week, it looked like they might make it stick, because the story they told, young nurse marries in, isolates the patriarch, walks off with the crown jewel, is a story everyone thinks they already know. Judge Okonkwo asked hard questions. She asked whether Harold had independent counsel at the transfer. And that was where the truth turned the whole thing, because Harold had insisted on Walter Pruitt, his own attorney of 30 years, being present. And Walter had, in his careful way, made a contemporaneous memo and a 2-minute video on his phone of Harold, lucid and clear, explaining in his own words that he was transferring the shares to protect the home care division and the 400 jobs in it. Estelle's lawyers had built their case on the assumption that no one would have documented it. They had, once again, underestimated the value of reading a situation to the end. Judge Okonkwo issued her expedited ruling on the Thursday. She held that the transfer was valid, that my 41% was mine, that the prenuptial agreement's transferred interest provision governed, and that under the binding arbitration clause, the matter was closed. No appeal to the courts, no war of attrition. She scheduled the enforcement conference for that Saturday at First Cascade Bank, the same day and place Estelle had chosen for her sale. Estelle did not yet fully understand what the ruling meant because she still hadn't read the prenup, and her lawyers, I later gathered, had spent Thursday and Friday trying to find her a way out and finding none. It was all going to happen in the viewing room she'd booked to celebrate her victory. Before the weekend was over, the thing she'd built to close a door on me was going to open one instead. The viewing room at First Cascade Bank is smaller than you'd imagine, maybe 14 by 16 feet, with a long table of pale maple and a single high window that lets in a narrow bar of light. On that Saturday morning, the last Saturday of November, the light came in cold and thin and lay across the table like a ruler. Estelle arrived first, in a charcoal suit this time, with 2 lawyers from Marsh, Corrigan, and Boone, and a representative from Cormorant Partners, a young man in an expensive coat who kept checking his phone. I arrived with Dolores and with Walter Pruitt, and Daniel arrived on his own, having driven separately, which I understood as its own small declaration. Estelle looked at him when he sat beside me rather than beside her, and something moved across her face that she caught and folded away, but I saw it, a single hard blink, and then her jaw set and her folded hands pressed flat on the maple table until the knuckles went white. That was her tell, the one I'd seen 100 times without naming it, When Estelle was losing control of a room, she pressed her hands flat and still, as if she could hold the whole situation down by force. The bank's trust officer, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Antilla, brought in the deed box and the share certificates and the trust instruments and laid them on the table, and Estelle's lead lawyer began to speak about the agenda for the shareholder vote, as if Thursday's ruling had not happened. Dolores let him get about 2 sentences in. Then she slid a copy of Judge Okonkwo's ruling across the maple table, unhurried, and she said, "Before we proceed to any vote, the ownership and voting rights of the 41% block have been finally determined by binding arbitration, per the parties' agreement. I direct your attention to page 4. I watched Estelle read it. She read fast at first, then slower. Then she went back to the top, and I understood that she was reading, for the first time in 7 years, the document she had commissioned. I watched her reach the transferred interest provision, and then the arbitration clause, and I watched her hands, flat on the table, begin to tremble very slightly. Not a dramatic thing, just a fine vibration she could not stop, the tell of a woman who had spent her whole life certain she was the one holding the papers. She did not go pale, and she did not cry out, because that was not who she was. Estelle Whitfield had never in her life let anyone see her flinch. What she did was reach for the institutional posture she always reached for. "This transfer was undue influence," she said, her voice steady, "and we will litigate it in the proper court." Dolores did not raise her voice. She said, "There is no court, Estelle. You wrote the clause that says so. It's on page 9, the one you had your lawyers insist upon, to keep a fight over transferred interests out of the courts and away from the press. It worked exactly as designed. It's simply working for the other side." For a long moment, Estelle said nothing, and the young man from Cormorant Partners quietly slid his chair back an inch, the way people do when they realize they've walked into someone else's collapse. Then Estelle did the thing that told me the whole truth about her, which is that she abandoned the vote and reached instead for a deal. Then we discussed terms, she said, still institutional, still hiding behind procedure even as the ground gave way. Every family of a certain size finds an accommodation. She used the same phrasing she'd used across that salad 7 years earlier, the language of diligence and accommodation, the language of rules. And I realized that Estelle had never once in her life done anything personal, that everything cruel she had ever done to me, she had done as policy, and that this, right now, was the closest thing to a plea she was capable of, dressed up as a negotiation so she'd never have to admit she was asking. I had rehearsed a speech, over 6 weeks of midnight preparation, a real one, cold and complete, and sitting in that thin bar of light with my 41%, finally, quietly settled, I found I didn't want to give it. There was no satisfaction to be found in watching a proud woman disassemble herself with dignity. So I said the only thing that mattered. There's no accommodation to discuss, Estelle. The home care division isn't for sale. Not to Cormora, not to anyone. The 400 people who staff it keep their jobs. I hold 59% of the vote with Daniel, and I intend to run this company the way Harold built it. And then, because she had made me carry my sleeping daughter down a gravel path past a scuffed brass kickplate, I allowed myself exactly 1 sentence more, said evenly, without heat. "You told me the front hall was for family and guests, and that I was neither. As it turns out, the front hall is mine now, and you're welcome to use whichever door you like." She pressed her hands flat one last time, and then she stood, and she gathered her lawyers with a small motion of her chin, and she walked out of the viewing room with her spine perfectly straight, and I will give her this: she never broke, not visibly, not once. The Cormorant representative left 30 seconds behind her, texting. Ruth Antilla, the trust officer, began the quiet work of returning the certificates to the deed box. Dolores exhaled and squeezed my knee under the table, and Daniel put his hand over mine on the pale maple, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The balance had simply, finally, come to rest. That was 8 months ago now. Harold died in February, at home in the East Sunroom, with Daniel and me both there, and he was clear enough at the end to know how it had gone, and he squeezed my hand once, hard, which was the only thank you either of us needed. The divorce that everyone assumed would follow did not follow, because there was no divorce. Daniel and I are still in the house in Meridian, and he stepped down from the engineering firm he'd been hiding in to help me run the home care division he'd never been allowed to love out loud. Estelle kept her 33% because it was hers, and I am not in the business of taking what belongs to other people. But she resigned from the board within the month and moved to a condominium in Scottsdale near the Arizona cousin, and we do not speak, and that too is a kind of peace. Last Sunday we had people over, Dolores and Walter Pruitt, who at 74 still keeps a contemporaneous memo of everything, and a handful of the home care staffers whose jobs stayed jobs, and my mother, who worked 30 years on an overnight fruit packing line and now sat in my kitchen holding her granddaughter. I made my green chile pozole, the same recipe from the pot Estelle once exiled to a mudroom, and this time it sat in the center of the table and disappeared before the evening was half over. Marisol, who is 2 now, walked a lopsided lap around the living room to general applause. And I did a thing I'd been planning quietly. I'd set up a small fund out of the division's first genuinely profitable quarter, a hardship fund for our home care aides, the ones who drive 80 miles between clients on their own gas. And I announced it that night with a glass of cheap Prosecco raised in my mother's chipped tile kitchen, and everyone toasted, and my mother cried, and I did not. I've thought a lot about that scuffed brass kickplate on the servant's door, the one worn white like a smile that had given up. For 7 years, the Whitfields taught me that there were rooms I was allowed into and rooms I wasn't, doors that were mine and doors that never would be. What none of them understood, least of all Estelle, was that I had never once measured my worth by which door they let me use. I measured it by the fact that I read every line, fed a dying man one small spoon at a time, and refused to become smaller to fit the space they offered me. You do not become worthy by being let in the front. You were always worthy. The door was only ever a question about them.